I'm Arnav Datta. I'm the Managing Director of Policy Implementation at Employ America and the Director of Infrastructure Policy at the Institute for Progress. Very excited to be moderating this really important panel today about accelerating policy solutions for geothermal energy. So obviously it's a big moment for geothermal energy. We've got technological innovation happening at a pretty rapid clip. We've got load growth issues as it relates to AI data center demand. And there's just a lot of, no pun intended, energy surrounding this industry. And the president has also signaled an interest in an all-of-the-above energy strategy. You've seen these reflected in his executive orders, both unleashing American energy and declaring a national energy emergency. And they've specifically called out accelerating next-gen geothermal as a priority area. But to date, the US only utilizes less than 1% of its geothermal potential. There's a lot of reasons for this. There's costly permitting reforms, capital challenges, supply chain challenges. Meanwhile, we've got other countries, including China, that are trying to increase their focus on geothermal energy, not just for power generation, but also for industrial heating and cooling. We're seeing the private sector start to catch up, including traditional oil and gas companies like Chevron, BP, but also oilfield services companies like Halliburton and Baker Hughes. There are a lot of interesting, potentially transformative investments happening. At the state level, we're starting to see people pick this up as well. We just got that great message from the governor of Idaho. Last year, the Texas legislature passed a bill that could serve as a model for federal legislation and also other states. So I'm really excited to moderate this panel today. I hope that those of you who are in the policy world, on the Hill, in government, or at nonprofit organizations can take the lessons from our great panel of experts here. So with that, I'd like to introduce them all. Thomas Hockman is the Director of Infrastructure Policy at the Foundation for American Innovation, where he works on regulatory reform and infrastructure policy. His research has appeared in American Affairs, The Hill, and he's got a BS from Mathematical Sciences from the University of Vermont. Michael Yancey is the Director of Congressional Policy at CRESS, where he bridges policy and government relations efforts to advance pragmatic energy solutions in Congress. Drew Bond is the CEO and founder of C3 Solutions, where he's got decades of experience in the conservative movement and the private sector. He worked for President George W. Bush as an energy policy advisor. And finally, Barry Smitherman is the chairman, president, and co-founder of the Texas Geothermal Energy Alliance, an organization dedicated to education, public awareness, and advocacy on behalf of the Texas geothermal energy. He's also an adjunct professor who teaches energy law. So Michael, I'd like to start with you. We're still in the first 100 days of the Trump administration. They're working hard to accelerate domestic energy production, and Congress is also considering a number of different packages that could boost energy production domestically. CRESS just released a geothermal policy roadmap. Can you walk us through the highlights, why this report is important at this time, some things that maybe are underrepresented in the policy conversations as well?
Sure. Thanks, Arnab. CRESS is a right-of-center organization focused on an all-of-the-above energy policy. So I think with the President Trump retaking the White House, his number one mandate, or I guess three mandates in energy policy, is affordability, reliability, and energy dominance. And so thinking through that lens, we wrote this report on geothermal energy to really educate members of Congress and their staff, policymakers in the executive branch who may not have exposure to geothermal. It is such a small percentage, as Arnab said, less than 1% of the energy mix of the United States. But it's really, really important for policymakers to have a good understanding of what geothermal is, what the various technologies are, and the advanced technologies that are coming of age right now, what those potential technologies can do for us. We also go into the applications of geothermal energy technology. So we focus on the defense sector and what it could do and what it's currently doing for the Department of Defense and military installations. We examine, which we had previously, another panel just talked about, the data center case for geothermal, both in terms of power production and heating and cooling. And then we go into some other applications for residential, commercial heating and cooling. Lithium extraction is a future use case. Agriculture is a future use case. There's some others. And then we kind of do an overview of the industry itself and where it is. It's still, as we've said multiple times, very small, but it's looking to ramp up very rapidly. Some estimates suggest, I believe the Department of Energy suggests it'll be about 90 gigawatts by 2050 in the United States. The International Energy Agency actually released a report back in December that indicates that China is actually accounts for about 70% of investments into geothermal today. And
Wow.
so they have a chart in their report that shows that China is, by 2050, will have more than 50% of the geothermal industry from now. So I think
Wow.
that's really critical for policymakers to really look at, because as we've talked about, geothermal is domestic, it is reliable, it is clean. There's a lot of reasons to really like it. And so we provide a list of policy recommendations focused on the issues that you brought up for the constraints, namely providing a permitting form for just deploying it faster, maintaining the current technology neutral investment tax credit and production tax credit is really important for bringing down those capital costs, and then substantially continuing robust funding for research and development to make sure that those costs can come down in the future, and that there is federal support for those demonstration projects, getting technologies from the lab to commercialization.
Lab to commercialization. That's great. I'd like to touch on a number of things that you mentioned there. I guess sticking first on the federal side, Thomas, there's a lot of federal lands, particularly in the West, that are some of the hottest in the country. Wow, I've just loaded this with puns. But tapping into that will be is necessary to achieve President Trump's vision of energy dominance. Can you dig a little deeper on that nexus between permitting, federal lands, and geothermal, and what we could expect as a policy recommendation?
Sure, yeah. So an enormous amount of the U.S.'s geothermal potential is on federal land, right? So one estimate from BLM said that 90% of our hydrothermal potential is on federal land. Maybe for EGS it's a little bit lower, but no matter how you slice it, it's a really high percentage. So if we care about scaling and commercializing geothermal, we have to care about our federal permitting process, and particularly our permitting process on federal land. Unfortunately, right now, our permitting process on federal land is incredibly burdensome. So the existence of federal land, a project that happens on federal land, inherently triggers NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the permitting process, which is infamously burdensome for energy infrastructure and infrastructure of all sorts. So NEPA, an environmental impact statement, or NEPA, which is one level of review, takes an average of 4.5 years. For energy projects, litigation rates are incredibly high, right? So, for solar projects on federal land, for example, it's litigation rates between 60 and 70%. For pipelines, 50%, transmission and wind, above 30%, right? So that's also a huge risk. It's not just the 4.5 years, but it's the risk of litigation on the back end. It's not just that, but for geothermal, oftentimes over the course of a development cycle, it triggers NEPA multiple times. So there's a famous graphic that shows a geothermal project triggering NEPA 6 different times over the course of a development process. So, a couple of years for every single time NEPA is triggered, do the math. Now, 6 might not actually be like the modal outcome here, but if you talk to a company like Fervo or other geothermal companies, they usually say, no, 2 or 3 NEPAs is pretty commonplace, pretty hard to avoid. So, what can we do about that? The best thing we can do is have an active Congress. Critically, NEPA is a procedural environmental law. It's not a substantive environmental law, right? So a substantive environmental law is one like the Clean Air Act, which says you can't pollute this amount, or the Clean Water Act, which says your discharge must be below this limit. NEPA doesn't do that. NEPA doesn't actually offer material environmental protections. It mandates a process, right? So in my view, if we were to repeal NEPA tomorrow, we would not be environmentally worse off. In fact, if anything, we'd be environmentally better off. But short of that, recognizing what the current appetite is, really the huge problem for NEPA is litigation, right? It's the fact that obstructionist groups who don't want to see a project get built can sue over and over and over again until financing for a project runs out. We call this the litigation doom loop. And so, there are all sorts of proposals out there. One that I tend to like quite a bit is actually IFP's time limit on injunctions, which says that, basically we need to set a shot clock for how long a court can issue an injunction to stop a project. This is a common response to NEPA litigation. But it's pretty clear that if we do want to do something about judicial review with NEPA and also other environmental laws like the Endangered Species Act, which tend to get in the way of infrastructure development, we need Congress to do it. There's lots of really great administrative things that this administration can do, and I think we'll probably talk about them later. But ultimately, the real skeleton key is Congress.
Thank you. Yeah. If you guys want to Google litigation doom loop, there's a bunch of great articles that some people have wrote. I don't know. Barry, I'd like to turn to you and stay domestic, but get to the state side. The legislation that your organization helped push through passed with just a total of 3 no votes, I believe.
Actually, it was 1 no vote.
Oh, even better, 1 no vote. Can you talk a bit about the type of coalition you built, how you built it, and any lessons that you think could, should, or do not apply to the federal landscape?
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here. Our genesis came about after Winter Storm Uri in February of 21, which knocked out power for about 25 million Texas for up to 5 days. And it became clear to everyone that we needed more dispatchable, firm, 24/7 electricity. Solar's great, wind is great. One of the roles that I've held previously was chairman of the Texas Public Utility Commission, which is the electricity regulator, and then I went to the Railroad Commission, which does not regulate railroads, but the oil and gas industry. And so Matt Welch and I were approached by the Mitchell Foundation in the summer of 21 to try to begin to educate policymakers and the general public about the benefits of geothermal energy. And it became crystal clear to me. This was the unicorn. This was whatever metaphor you want to use, the silver bullet, which would be firm, dispatchable, eventually cheap and clean. And so we began to meet with policymakers, stakeholders, just about everyone that would meet with us. Matt and I probably had 100 Zoom calls and meetings as we began to try to push an agenda for geothermal energy. And what we found with our legislative program, which had 3 pieces to it. One, and one of the Chris's in the panel before referred to this, one, clarified who owns the heat. Mm-hmm. You would think that's clear, but it was not clear because we have surface estate and mineral estate, so we clarified that. We consolidated all of the regulatory jurisdiction in one body. It had been spread in several agencies. That's probably the case here federally and in some other states as well. And then we had a great feel-good policy initiative that a geothermal operator could adopt an abandoned oil well. Mm. So we had a 3-piece regulatory legislative policy which drew Democrats, Republicans together. Those that were big advocates of clean energy got on board with it. Generally, those left of center, our friends on the Democratic Party. And then because we rely upon the oil and gas industry, its skill set, its workforce, our knowledge of what the world looks like below the surface, because we've drilled over 1 million wells in Texas. They were supportive. Everyone was supportive of a 24/7 clean energy resource. And so as we advanced these bills, we had 1 Democratic sponsor, we had 2 Republican sponsors in both chambers. We received 1 no vote. We actually went back to this member afterwards, and I think he was confused about what he was voting against. You don't see that kind of bipartisan support for any kind of energy these days. We've kind of gotten into tribal philosophies about one side likes wind and solar and the other one likes oil and gas. We need it all, as we have articulated here this afternoon and this morning. In Texas, we're supposed to double our load between now and 2030. That's a staggering number for us. So we need everything, as we like to say, above and below if we're going to meet this incredible demand. And I do think geothermal is that very unique energy resource which brings both parties together.
Yeah, that's great. I guess zooming out a bit, Drew, there's an international competitiveness angle here too. Michael alluded to it. How do you think next generation geothermal energy can put the U.S. at an advantage compared to geopolitical, geoeconomic rivals like China, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can very much put us at a geopolitical advantage. I mean, I think one of the things we've seen with natural gas, for instance, right? Natural gas with the fracking revolution, we were able to tap resources that we didn't even know existed, or we at least didn't know we could tap economically. And so that changed the game completely, right? We went from an energy importer to an energy exporter. We also reduced our greenhouse gas emissions faster than anybody in the world because of natural gas. Mm-hmm. That, in my mind, is the best kind of global leadership. I mean, you can sign treaties and what have you, but if you're actually out there doing the real work, reducing the emissions with the technology, creating jobs and investments, there's nothing better. So, it's been said here, the parallels between what was the fracking revolution to maybe what will be the geothermal revolution are very clear. I mean, very similar technology, very similar skill sets. With natural gas, obviously, you're poking a hole in the ground and getting eventually liquid out, and geothermal, you're poking a hole in the ground and eventually getting steam and electricity out. And so, and to do it in a way that's clean, and then when you look at the map of the geothermal resources, we used to talk about the United States being the Saudi Arabia of coal. When you look at the map of geothermal resources, we're probably the Saudi Arabia of geothermal. And so we ought to be tapping those resources, to use your pun, and we ought to be tapping them fast because they are firm, they are clean, as Barry said, and there's just like no reason not to. I mean, the energy footprint of geothermal, as you know, I'm preaching to the choir here, but is so much better than solar. And I have a solar company. I'm not anti-solar. Solar is awesome for some locations and some applications, but it's not all the time everywhere. And when I think about the technology space and our ability to lead globally, China is all over our friends and allies in South America and Africa, investing in and getting a hold of resources. Mm-hmm. And not only the resources, but the know-how and the investment that goes along with that. And we ought to be doubling down on geothermal right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting. I think hearing about the Texas reforms that Barry mentioned, it seems like there's a couple of abstract kind of policy things you can pull out of it. Obviously, the consolidation and like regulatory clarity. The resource clarity kind of creates puts more, of an incentive in place, a monetary incentive. Michael, in your report, one of your recommendations was to maintain the tech-neutral tax incentives. I'd love to hear more about that, but also kind of how the fiscal, like the investment challenge is addressed, because we know there's a lot of permitting challenges. We've all kind of worked on that, but I think there are project finance challenges as well, and I'd love to kind of hear more about how that fits in, both with maintaining the energy, the tax production incentives you mentioned, but also more broadly things like demonstration projects, funding, and we had a shale revolution because George Mitchell was able to take a bunch of risk, but he also had a cost share program from the Department of Energy. And I think, there's analogies there I'd love to hear more about.
Sure. So I think there's a lot of questions in there.
Yeah.
But I think primarily CREZ is a strong supporter of tax credits that deploy energy technology domestically. And so being that geothermal, there's domestic workforce, there's domestic, America is the leader in oil and gas and has a very strong drive for innovative technologies. Geothermal is very closely tied to that and can use a lot of that experience in a cooperative way. If we're going to be investing in energy in America, it needs to focus on that domestic production, right? And so the key problem with geothermal, number one being permitting, number two being high capital costs. And so the federal government should be providing support in some way to bring down those capital costs, especially when you get the value of the electricity, the heat, the reliability, all the things that we've all been discussing today. Those tax credits, both the investment tax credit, which is very helpful for bringing down the capital cost, and the production tax credits, which is very helpful to bring down the production cost and actually create an additional incentive for those longer term projects, like nuclear too. Like that's something else that the tech neutral credits are applicable for. These are all good things for America to invest in, and what Drew was talking about with China and the opportunity for America to lead here, we really need to invest more. And so I think these tax credits can be used to really attract that capital and to allow these pre-revenue companies, the startups, to really lean in and bring America's innovative edge to bear on a whole new sphere for the market. I would love to see a second energy revolution similar to the fracking revolution, but with geothermal.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thomas, the president recently issued a number of executive orders, I mentioned up front, and called out geothermal. How do you think these orders and also any other kind of initiatives, decisions, regulatory changes coming out of the administration, how do you think these will impact geothermal?
Yeah, so there were really two big early energy executive orders, right? There was unleashing American energy and declaring a national energy emergency. The latter was interesting, right? It encourages agencies to use waiver authorities to skirt existing permitting processes. But I actually think that unleashing American energy, which changed existing regulations, is in many ways more interesting because it's more durable, right? So the big thing there is that, and we're going to get wonky here, but you're at a permitting focused panel, so here we are. It rescinded CEQ, the Council on Environmental Quality. This is the agency that has been responsible for issuing binding rules on agencies around NEPA since 1978. It rescinded their authority to issue these binding rules. And it also said that CEQ has to rescind its existing regulations as well. So what that means is that whereas agencies had to play by CEQ's framework for the last 45 plus years, agencies now get the opportunity to write their own NEPA regulations. This is really quite a big deal, and I think a lot of folks maybe haven't even sort of come to terms with potentially how big of a deal it could be. Because CEQ didn't just play a role, as like a centralized body, right, or as a coordinating agency, but rather its regulations consistently went beyond the language of the statute. So, I think the perfect example of this is in 2023, Congress passed the Fiscal Responsibility Act, right, the FRA. And it was the first time that the core language and definitions of NEPA were amended. These are the key definitions that the sort of the overall burden of NEPA really turns on. So, major federal action, which is what triggers NEPA in the first place. Up until 2023, a major federal action was an action that is potentially subject to federal control and responsibility. In 2023, the Fiscal Responsibility Act amends that definition to an action that's subject to substantial federal control and responsibility. That is clearly a change in the threshold for NEPA. But CEQ, in its Phase 2 regulations, does this jujitsu, where it says, actually, substantial could be read as expanding the scope of NEPA, because without the word substantial, federal control and responsibility could be understood to mean requiring full federal control and responsibility. But of course, we have 50 years of evidence that that's not at all how NEPA has been applied. And the name of the bill that actually changed the definition was literally the Builder Act, right? Like this is a bill where the clear mandate is to streamline NEPA. But fortunately now those regulations are gone. And so agencies have to take a plain reading of the Fiscal Responsibility Act and its changes to the original text of NEPA. And I think that creates a huge opportunity. And I think that's especially true for geothermal. And I'll give you one more example here, which is that the Fiscal Responsibility Act changed the definition or the standard for a categorical exclusion, which allows you to not go through the higher levels of environmental review, from an action subject to, or sorry, that does not have a significant impact on the human environment to one that normally does not have a significant impact on the human environment. Well, believe it or not, we have decades of evidence of geothermal going through an environmental assessment and resulting in a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact. So we have years of data showing that these different geothermal processes do not result in a significant impact on the human environment. So that's all to say that I think that an enormous percentage of geothermal activities that typically go through NEPA right now, a higher level of review, could go through a categorical exclusion instead, which takes a matter of months instead of a matter of years. It doesn't have to go through notice and comment, right? The litigation risk is lower. So the task now falls on agencies to get this right? To create and issue these new regulations. But I think the opportunity here is enormous.
That's great. Drew, you've also done some thinking on permitting, reform, NEPA. Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we, as Thomas understands this chapter and verse, when you look at geothermal, and just from a layman's perspective, with all of that environmental background and litigation and what we know, right, we should be able to state today that geothermal is clean energy and therefore is exempt from all NEPA requirements. In the industry, it's called a categorical exclusion or a CADEX. CADEXs exist for other technologies on federal lands, actually for oil and gas. Why we wouldn't offer up a CADEX for geothermal on federal lands is beyond me. I feel like it's actually in the power even of this administration to issue categorical exclusions for those lands that they have executive control over, namely the Department of Defense and national labs. Both DoD facilities and national labs have a couple things in common. One, they're grid connected. Two, they're secure, literally, fences and guards and gates. And three, they use a lot of energy. And so there's an opportunity there to use those not as proving grounds for unproven technology. I'm talking about deploying proven technology faster on government property, taxpayer-owned property, right, that's not currently being utilized. And so you don't have to give up the land. We could lease it. We could actually have it generate revenue for the taxpayers and also solve a problem even for the data center community, because data centers are looking for places to build data centers. Now, that isn't always exactly where you need it to be relative to a military base or a national lab, but I guarantee you there's some overlap there. So I think there's some things that we can do to be creative here. Number one, I'd want CADEX for all geothermal. Number two, I'd love to see the administration issue an executive order basically saying we want to issue an RFP for geothermal on all these properties and lay out the map, because I think, the cost of capital is key here, but so much of the cost of capital is tied to the cost of regulations and the time that it takes to get these projects done. If you cut that down, the cost of capital comes down significantly and we can deploy energy faster.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think, this is actually indicative of bipartisan support in this area. There was, Department of Interior did issue a CADEX, I think last year, for geothermal exploration that is, I think, as close to the legislative Energy Policy Act CADEX from 2005. So, that's something that the Biden administration deemed worthwhile to do. There was also their energy infrastructure executive order that, created some processes for opening up more federal lands. And I think, Thomas, that's still in place, right? The energy infrastructure EO?
Yeah, I think so.
And so, there's at least some hope for continuity and maybe even building on that. I think that seems pretty promising. I have a kind of a
Arnaud,
question.
if I could, before we
Yeah.
get off of permitting, I have to talk about the Railroad Commission.
Yeah.
Because really permitting comes down to culture as well as process. So the Railroad Commission has jurisdiction over all drilling permits, including geothermal. And the Railroad Commission believes that it is in a partnership with industry, not an overseer, not a lord, but a partner. And as a result, you can get a drilling permit at the Railroad Commission in weeks. Sometimes we got it down to days. In 2014, we issued 24,000 drilling permits. That's 100 permits every business day. That's willpower, but it's also culture. And we define waste, which the Railroad Commission has a mandate to avoid waste, as a resource that's stuck in the ground. So our objective is to get it up to the surface so that it can be utilized for our citizens and for our economy. Sage, you heard Cindy up here earlier, just recently received the first injection permit from the Railroad Commission for a geothermal well. We've been working on this for a couple of months. I dare to imagine, had this been on federal lands, how long it would have taken to have gotten this. It would have been years. They'd still be working on it. But the Railroad Commission has this culture and philosophy of working in partnership. So not only do we need to streamline our rules and regulations, but we have to have a thought change about how we're approaching our resources.
That's great. I was gonna ask you what else we can learn from Texas. So that's very helpful. I guess finishing off for all of you with a couple of last questions. We've got an act where we're still in the first 100 days. There's a lot of legislative opportunities. There's an administration that is aligned on a lot of what you guys have talked about here. If you gaze into your crystal balls, predict what you think, what you hope, what should happen in Congress or in the executive branch in the next couple of years, couple of months, couple of years, what would it be? I'll start with Michael, and we can just roll all the way down.
Sure. As a former congressional staffer, I don't like to prognosticate what will happen.
Why would that be?
It's really hard to tell, fine-tune exactly what Congress is going to do.
Yeah.
What we would love to see happen is I kind of see it as like there's the opportunity, what we love to see happen, and the risk of what we don't want to see happen. The opportunity is, they're looking at reconciliation, and there's going to be a balance of do they take the scalpel or the sledgehammer, and we would love to see more of a scalpel approach where they fix the current tax regime to make sense for incentivizing domestic production of energy in a very smart, thoughtful way versus just destroying the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, getting rid of the barriers and permitting reform. So less sticks and more carrots, basically. I think the risk there is, given just the divisive nature of politics in DC, I think there's a risk that geothermal itself as an industry is also politicized. And I'm not seeing that right now. I think it's very bipartisan. There are Democrats with strong pieces of legislation. There are Republicans with strong pieces of legislation. But DC is a place where politics really comes to life. And I think it would be very unfortunate if it were to be politicized in one way or the other. So I think geothermal is good for America. It's not good for one side or the other. It's good for all of us.
That's great. Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, so, I think there are a couple different flashpoints for geothermal related bills, right? So reconciliation coming up is certainly one of them. It's going to be both IRA related stuff around the tech neutrals, but also, I think that there are real opportunities for permitting reform. I don't think they'll look the way that you would want them to look in regular order, where you need 60 votes, because the rules of reconciliation are wonky. But there are certainly things that you can do. Then in 2026, the surface transportation bills are coming up for reauthorization. So in 2021, that ended up as the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so it's a pretty natural place for an infrastructure package to happen. Notably, both in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA, geothermal ended up getting left out of a lot of discussions. Certainly it benefits from the tech neutrals, but historically it has not gotten as much money and as much funding in these bills as other energy technologies. That makes a certain amount of sense historically, right? Because the sort of the EGS breakthroughs only started to happen around 2021, 2022. But making sure that we address that in the next round, I think, is super important. Yeah, I think those are the two main ones. I think there are probably other opportunities for just other regular order bipartisan bills, right? I mean, Mike Lee and AOC both introduced geothermal bills last year, but I think those are the major touch points.
True.
Yeah, I mean, I'd reiterate, issue a categorical exclusion. I think you have to go through some kind of environmental legal process for about a year, but we should get that done. The other is immediate expensing, is a tax provision that often isn't discussed in clean tech circles, so to speak. But basically, this was extended in I think back in 2017 as a part of the tax bill. And needs to be extended, in our view, should be made permanent, which would allow companies to make investments and expense those in the year that the investment is made, as opposed to carrying that out over 5 to 7 years. We just think that is far more efficient for capital and far more efficient for making decisions to invest capital. And then I also think about the Department of Energy. I worked there under the George W. Bush administration. Investing in energy R&D is critical. I think we have, as often is referred to, the crown jewels being our national labs. I think there's a huge need for us to really kind of double down on that research. Double down doesn't necessarily mean double the amount of research from a cost perspective, but really to think creatively about what really needs to get done and how can these labs participate in helping to accelerate, the energy innovation kind of transformation here in the U.S. and globally. So, I hope that all of those things added up together, when we come back together in a couple of years, we've gone from maybe 20 megawatts of geothermal to, I don't know, maybe 2 gigawatts of solar. Maybe that's too much, but I think we ought to aim high.
That makes a lot of sense. Barry?
Yeah, I'll readily admit I'm not a congressional expert, but I like what was said earlier today. I think we have to frame this as a national emergency. If you think about the way America comes together and came together in World War II, came together after 9/11, we rally, as Eisenhower said. You have to understand the American psyche. We want to be left alone until we are challenged collectively. And when we're challenged collectively, then we come together like no one else on the planet. So we think about, we want to dominate AI, we want to dominate energy, clean tech, we want to be secure. All of that ought to be a rally cry for geothermal, so that both parties come together to ensure that we are the dominant energy resource for the free world. And we can do that.
That's great. Well, we've got just a minute and a half. In one sentence, each of you, if there's anybody out there skeptical about what geothermal in Congress can do, what do you want to tell them? One sentence. We'll start with Barry.
It's easy to understand. We drill a hole in the ground to hot rock, we flow water across it, we bring it up as steam, and we make electricity. We just have to figure out how to do it quicker and cheaper, but we can do it.
Drew?
Wow, one sentence. On what geothermal and Congress can do?
Yeah, anyone who's kind of skeptical that this is a place for us to may have an opportunity.
Oh, I think where there is economic opportunity and economic freedom, technology innovation can accelerate, and we will see that happen.
Love that. Thomas?
Geothermal is technologically incredibly similar to fracking. We saw what happened with the fracking boom, and so the same thing can happen with geothermal.
Finish it off.
If you want to see action in Congress, just know that the squeaky wheel gets the oil. Make some noise. Make some noise.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining on this panel. Thank you all for joining us. Let's give a round of applause for the group.
Fire on the mountain, light